When BAFTA first asked me, I must say I was a little bit anxious, because sort of delivering the David Lean lecture does feel a bit like you're tiptoeing towards the establishment a bit. I hope that's not the case, because for sure there's one thing I think about directing, and that is, whether it's true or not, you have to start and you have to continue and you have to always believe, I think, that you're an outsider, that you're a contrarian. I think you've got to be singular, and if necessary, you've got to be unutterably difficult. The word that came to my mind was, you've got to be prepared to be arsey. There's no two ways about it. If you're going to direct, you have to be a bit arsey. David Lean, of course, was, without doubt, one of the arsiest directors of all time. He was difficult, he was mercurial, he was unyielding, and he was legendary, of course, for not tolerating fools or knaves or any kind of interference. He also directed some of the greatest movies ever made. And we are all and will always be forever in his debt. Collision, conflict, character. That, to me, is the essence of Lean's brilliance. And Lean's Zhivago spoke to me as almost nothing else had. This was cinema. And it was also, so far as I was concerned, the way the world is. And that's really where my journey began. School wasn't so good. I was expelled from one. I went to a better one, then I got excluded from that, narrowly avoided the scrap heap, and ended up, much to my and everyone else's, certainly my dad's surprise, going to university. But it was a close-run thing, and it wasn't pretty, because being lost and incredibly bolshy really isn't very pretty, especially if you're the one being the pain in the arse. But, and it's been the saving grace of my life in more ways than one, I loved football and I loved the movies. Moving pictures broadly, movies, television, gave me a world to explore, a way to be, a language to use, something to aim at. And the most precious thing of all, once I'd been lucky enough to get into the television industry, a community within which to grow, hopefully gain a little maturity, and eventually and fitfully to find my own voice. Working in television for me was fundamental. That's where I learnt how to make films and how to tell stories and how to shoot and how to cut, how to work with actors. It's where I learnt sort of film grammar. And it's a hugely important, and has always been a hugely important industry in this country, because it's provided so many directors who've gone on and, you know, worked in the film industry. I started at Granada Television. After a bit of local programs, I ended up on a wonderful program called World in Action. Those were the days, because World in Action taught me how to tell a story, how to write, how to shoot, how to direct, how to cut against the clock, skills I use all the time to this day. And most of all, it was where I learned about the world of the 1980s, the Troubles, the miners' strike, Reagan and Thatcher, Central America, the Falklands War, apartheid in South Africa, strike, war, revolution and famine. This was where I learned how the world worked, and who has the power and who doesn't have the power, and how the two are always in tension, and how the world always is in action. And that, I hope, has been my theme ever since. How the world works, whether it's the murder of a young black teenager on the streets of South London, or a mass shooting on the streets of a city in Northern Ireland, or Jason Bourne on the run, or the events of 9/11, or the dirty dealings that led us to go to war in Iraq, or Somali piracy. Whatever the films are, I've tried to make them as real as I can, as truthful as I can, and I've tried to make them reflect, above all, my developing point of view, what I think about those events. But why do directors direct? The job's never advertised. You can't apply for it. I don't think anybody in the history of movies has ever been standing on the street corner when a producer comes up and says, "You look just exactly like a director. We're shooting next week. Would you like to start?" It just never happens. It has happened to actors. And I think maybe it happens to movie executives. I think people in charge of giant media corporations trawl the streets of London and Los Angeles looking for guys in sharp suits and a fast line of talk and carefully coiffed hair, which of course would explain why so many... No, let's leave that one. No, the fact is you choose to direct movies. They don't choose you. And you need ambition, you need ego, you need vanity, of course, not that I've got any of those things, obviously. You need drive and stamina, and a vaguely persuasive manner, and some technical skills. And all of that lot will get you somewhere. They may even get you a movie. But on their own, they won't let you make a good one, and they won't let you develop over time as a filmmaker. You have to have something to say, and you have to burn with a great and inner desire to say it. And filmmaking, like any creative activity, whether it's writing or painting or whatever, is essentially a cruel exercise in emotional futility, because in your quest to find the film, you have to endure, in fact, secretly you crave it, to have every single flaw in your character, every single defect in your personality pitilessly exposed every single day, and every hope you ever had crushed and extinguished. And I'm sure there are some directors out there who will say that that is what it's like. It's called the director's syndrome, because every film, and this is the serious bit, that you conceive of in your mind is rooted, I think, in the powerful unconscious dreams of childhood. And it ends in the catastrophe of adult rushes. And then if you're lucky, and if you have a great editor, you manage to crawl out of the deep abyss of self-loathing to a place where the result is passable. But it can never remotely be as close to the sense of wonder you felt as a child in a theatre watching the projector. And this, of course, explains why so many of our great directors are either megalomaniacs, psychopaths, or just stark staring bonkers. And the only compensation, seems to me anyway, is that the journey itself is the reward. It's a bit like a journey. You have a map, but that's not the journey. The journey is the journey you take to make it, and you take that journey communally, and it's never quite, the places you end up are never quite the places that you thought you would end up, but they need to be enough close that it's not something, you know, unrecognisably different. After I left World in Action, I spent more than 10 years making, I mean, a couple of small British films, but mostly in television drama, writing my own screenplays and shooting them and learning how to use a dolly and cranes and how to shoot a schedule and how to set a scene, all the conventional language of dramatic filmmaking. And the films were fine, they weren't disastrous, I always worked, but neither did they really stand out. More to the point, they never corresponded to the films I'd written, to the films I'd seen in my mind's eye. And a little while later, I made what I think, well, I hope, is my only truly awful film. It was called The Theory of Flight, or The Theory of Shite, as my kids very helpfully call it. This is turning into a confessional, actually, isn't it, really? I could talk for hours, days in fact, and I did, about all the mistakes that I made on Theory of Flight. They were all mine. It was all my fault. For months I tormented myself, flayed myself for my own inadequacies. But when I'd analysed it all and finished beating myself up, I realised that my fundamental mistake was this. I had no point of view on the material. You've got to know what you're aiming for. And that, I think, is the hardest part of it all, is trying to articulate for yourself up front, and therefore be able to articulate it to your cast and crew, what the mission of the film is, what the creative mission, what your interpretation on the material, what it is you're trying to get out of it. And that's hard, at least I found it hard. But conversely, if you can find that, then that's really when you're moving towards making a film as opposed to shooting a screenplay. In The Murder of Stephen Lawrence film and Bloody Sunday, I finally found my way, my aesthetic. Handheld, first person, stripped out dialogue, action-led films of collision and conflict, where you're thrust into the action, gathering fragments and details along the way, and where the very sparseness of dialogue paradoxically allows characters and theme to emerge more clearly. And I found my voice as a filmmaker, I think, the way to make a successful marriage between the factual world I'd come from and the dramatic world I was inhabiting. In the end, I found cinema. To my surprise, after Bloody Sunday, I then started making commercial movies, which was not something I'd ever thought about in the great beast of Hollywood. And before I went, I was very worried. Well, that's a lie, actually. I was very, very happy to get paid properly for the first time. But I did wonder if it would be possible to work there and still be true to myself. Would I recognise the films that I made there as mine, or would I have to choose between coming home a failure or selling out? Now, there's a fair amount of baloney talked about Hollywood, and sometimes I read the film pages and you'd think the place was run entirely by cynical corporate hacks. Okay, there may be some truth in that, but only some. In my experience, this is just my experience, it's also full of very smart people, very committed people, studio heads who understand filmmakers and support them superbly within a brutal commercial environment. Hollywood also has guilds and crafts and trade unions with power and a voice, unlike here, which is why the studios tour the world looking for places that don't, like the UK, where it's cheaper to make films. Now, I'm all for an economically progressive labour market. Our future as an emerging filmmaking powerhouse depends on it. But it does not. It absolutely does not require us to erect the kind of work experience rip-off culture we have in the UK film and television industry. The truth is, in my experience, Hollywood is a generalisation. There's the franchise business, which is creating global entertainment product, the Batmans and the Spider-Mans and the Bournes and the rest. And then there's the rest of movie production, which is largely dependent on franchise profits. Hollywood has also always made films about the way the world is, and always been very serious about it. And because of that commitment to serious filmmaking, my experience in commercial cinema, my ongoing adventure, has been almost entirely positive. In the Bourne movies, I found I could draw on the traditions of 1970s Hollywood cinema that I'd so loved when I was at college, and cross-fertilise them with my British documentary roots to create Saturday night popcorn movies that I was proud to make. Because Bourne had values I could relate to. He was oppositional, he was dissenting, he was profoundly moral in his way. And in the post-Iraq world, with all that mistrust injected into the bloodstream, there was a huge audience, I think, willing to respond to a character whose fundamental proposition was they're lying to us. Well, it's the oldest sort of truth, I think, about films, that there's the film you write, there's the film you shoot, and there's the film that you cut. And they're all different. And they're all in play against each other. You know, the final film you end up is the product of the interplay between those three. And very often, the skill of filmmaking, one of the skills of filmmaking, is to recognise when the film that you wrote needs to become the film that you're shooting, needs to become the film that you're cutting. And as for my style, the shaky cam, or not being able to direct piss into a pot, as my dad calls it. The truth is, when I started working out in Hollywood, I thought I was a very old-fashioned, actually. I thought I was sort of operating classical British social realist traditions. It was only later, when we were shooting the scene at Waterloo in Bourne Ultimatum, and whenever we started filming, you could see kids with their mobile phones shooting us, shooting the scene. And that was when I started to realise that the images that I made were no longer old-fashioned at all. They were exactly the kinds of images that young people were making themselves. Hurried, informal, fluid. But they weren't seeing those kinds of images in movie theatres, because we had entered an era of infinitely more permissive image making, where the thirst to control your own pictures wraps authenticity inside informality and is itself a response to an increasingly complex, rigidly controlled, technologically driven world. All I did was take it into the cinematic mainstream. In the end, the films I've made, from Bourne Supremacy and Ultimatum through United 93 and Green Zone to Captain Phillips, have all been films, I think, about the post-9/11 world. We all live in the explosion of experiences and perspectives that constitute our everyday life, where imperfect, intimate, hastily made images are grabbed, self-made, and shimmer and multiply in endless, dizzying, self-replicating patterns of light and sound, where reality, fact, fiction, as well as identity, nationality, gender, and ethnicity are constantly mixing and merging and in flux. Cinema began in the post-Cubist universe, where man could suddenly see, through the power of editing moving pictures, reality from multiple perspectives. It had never happened before, and it was a kind of liberation. Today, we are tiptoeing towards a new and even greater liberation. Tomorrow's string theory-driven digital universe, where endless, infinite copying, cutting, pasting, riffing, and looping of images and sound in 3 dimensions will dictate and shape our reality. Indeed, is already becoming our reality. It's becoming a new dimension all of its own. And what I think is happening here is that in this change, a new oral, or at least non-literary culture is fast emerging, with profound implications for all of us. It will bring us closer together as it drives us further apart. We will see the world simultaneously through the long and the short end of the telescope. We will record everything, have access to everything, and remember very little. But without doubt, stories told through moving pictures will remain a vital tool for making sense of values in this new terrain, and particularly movies that take their inspiration from reality. Does it matter, I ask, that man's earliest cave paintings of reality made the bulls and bisons look like Peanuts comic drawings? Did it really matter that Shakespeare's Henry V was a load of Tudor propaganda? No. And neither does it really matter that David Lean's Lawrence of Arabia took endless liberties with the historical facts, because in the end it was, as Steven Spielberg memorably observed, a miracle, a masterpiece of cinema, filled with collision and conflict and character and all the complexity of what it is to be human. And like man's earliest cave paintings and the plays of Shakespeare, and every bit their equal, Lawrence of Arabia is an example of man's unfolding engagement with the world he lives in. Because the space between the true and the real is and always has been uniquely creative. It's a place to hypothesize and to reenact. A rich and sacred place where facts are bent out of shape and reimagined for good reasons and casual reasons, reasons always contentious, and for bad reasons. But out of that process, and only if we protect them, some of our greatest movies will continue to be made by the David Leans of tomorrow. Thank you.
You can relax now. Did you enjoy that?
Yeah, it was fine, actually. It's a bit nerve-wracking. It's not your usual, you know.
Before I open it up for questions, can I just ask you about the word reality?
Yes.
Because it came up a lot in your talk. You talk about showing me the mess of reality, and you talked about your actors performing in the moment. And the truth is that usually your actors are performing with real people, if we can use that term. Can you just explain a little bit about how Captain Phillips, United 93, what you get out of surrounding your actors with real people?
Well, I mean, listen, I wasn't the first. If you get the right mix of professional actors and non-professional actors, a magical thing happens, essentially at a certain point, and it's always eggy to begin with, but if you create a good environment and a safe environment, what happens is the actors stop acting and the non-professional actors start acting, and they sort of mix and merge, and something beautiful happens, and you just get a very different quality, something without artifice, and something that feels real. And in the end, a lot of it is about observing procedures, but that's because that's something that I've always been very interested in. I think the procedures rule our lives. Our procedures define our modernity. You know, most of us don't get up and think about what happened to us when we were children. Most of us get up and think, I've got to get on the bus now, and then I've got to be at work at 10 o'clock, and I've got a meeting at 11 o'clock. So procedures. And if you can tap into that in films, you can actually develop a lot of emotional power, oddly. You'd think it would be dry, but it's actually not, because you get to a very, very rich place, which is what happens when procedures start to be threatened.
And the reason I mention that is that on the movie show that I do with Mark, the last scene in Captain Phillips, everybody wanted to talk about it, and they wanted to talk about it in a way that didn't spoil it for people who hadn't seen it. But that last scene with the nurse and Tom Hanks is truly extraordinary, and our hunch then, listening to what you're saying, is that you would not have got that if you hadn't been determined to put a real nurse in that scene.
Yeah, I mean, the truth about filmmaking is a lot of it is luck. The scene that we spent the day shooting was a scene all about Tom Hanks after he'd been rescued, when he'd been cleaned up, and we shot that all day until about 5 o'clock. And when you're shooting a scene and you know it's a big, big scene, you can tell when it's not working. And you feel at moments like that on a film, you know, intense anxiety, because you know that you can't come back. This is it. If you don't get it that day, that's it. There's no reshooting. We didn't have the money, and we'd never have got the ship, and that was it. And you know that your film is going to die if you don't get something. And about 5 o'clock, I was talking to the real captain, actually, and he said, well, actually, you'd have gone to the medical room first of all. I was just sort of trying to think of anything we could do that was different. And I said, well, where's the medical room? And he said, well, it's down the other end of a ship. Well, anybody who's ever been on a warship, getting from one end of the ship to the other is a total nightmare, because the corridors are about this big with bulkheads every 20 feet. So I said to Tom, listen, I think we should try down there. Are you up for it? He said, yeah, sure. So I said, okay, DFI everybody, we're going to go down to the medical room and we're going to try and shoot the scene there. Well, what happens at that moment is a rather beautiful and creative thing. It's called blind panic. Truly. Because everybody starts running in opposite directions. Oh my God, it's all changed. Oh my God, the director's mad. Oh my God, how are we going to do it? And everybody goes down, and Barry, Aykroyd and I race down there, and you know, we were getting short of time, and I said to the captain, will there be any medical team? He said, yeah, the orderly will be on duty. Whoever's on duty, you can use them. So we got there, and this young corpsman was there, Danielle, and I said, listen, do you mind if we shoot this scene? I mean, they knew we were on the ship, you know. What, me? She said, yeah. I said, it's fine. Listen, it's just like a training exercise. It's just, it'll be Tom Hanks. And she went, white as a sheet. It's absolutely a true story. And we're now in complete panic because Tom's got to get changed. It's a makeup change. Oh my God, now it's 5 to 6. And what are we going to do? And she's panicking. And Barry's there. And I said, listen, just fucking, let's just turn over. And we turned over. And Tom walked in, and Barry and I, it was a tiny room, it was about the size of that table, and Barry and I sort of crabbed round to the left as she went. As soon as she clapped eyes on Tom and he walked, she completely dried. She was going like this. And Barry and I were sort of coming around to the left, and then Barry stumbled, I fell over, and it was just chaos, and it all fell apart. And but there was something in the room. You could feel it. You could just feel it. It had drama. It was the right place to be, and that was where the scene was going to be. And then we came out, and I said to Tom, let's go. I said, did you feel that? He said, oh, absolutely. He said, I totally feel different. He said, now it's something about the fact that she's a woman, and I'm all this, and I've got the blood all over me, and it's just very strange, and I feel just very vulnerable, and okay, let's go again. And we walked in, and that was it. The second take was the film.
Captain Phillips, please come in. Have a seat. Try my shoe. I'm Chief O'Brien. I'll be your corpsman today, okay? Can you please tell me what's going on? Can you talk? Can you tell me what's going on?
Yeah, I'm okay.
Are you okay? Because you don't look okay. Are you in any pain right now? Are you in any pain right now? Right there on your side. Okay, let me see it really quick. Can you lift up your arm a little bit? Does that hurt? A little bit?
A little bit.
Okay, is it tender? Go ahead and put your arm down. Okay, I need you to look at me. I need you to calm down, and I need you to breathe. There you go, deep breaths, there you go. Very good.
As a Bolshoi director, how do you maintain relationships with those that you're working with?
It's not really about being arsey and Bolshoi in the end. It's about carrying the trust of people who are going to give you a lot of money. And you don't do that by being foolish or picking fights. You do it by them believing that you know how to make the film and you being able to make your film. That's it. It's as simple as that. And if you can do that in a way that's civilized, that's better. But of course there are times when you've got to be tough and say, this is how it's going to be, or not listen to, and you're not always right, incidentally. You know, you can get yourself into places where, but one of the things about, that's why I was saying it sort of pitilessly exposes your human flaws. But one of the things you do learn, I think, about directing is you cannot stand still. You cannot not say that way. You can do it for a short while, you know. And it's better to do that and be wrong than it is to fuck around and not decide. You have to keep moving forward, and your command and control depends on deciding, directing, saying we go this way, and we go this way. And ultimately, you can't be right 100% of the time, but you have to be right more often than you're wrong. Otherwise, you don't work. Simple as that.
We thank the David Lean Foundation, but most particularly Paul Greengrass. Thank you very much.
Thank you.